So in this video, I'm going to be reviewing the Army Painter Speedpaint 2.0 mega set and letting you know my thoughts on whether or not I think this is worthwhile picking up or if it's even worthwhile delving into the latest Army Painter Speedpaints. I'm going to kick this off with something that's very un-YouTube-like and let you know my thoughts right off the bat, and that's that I don't think this is a worthwhile investment. And actually, I am crazy disappointed with the results that I've had from the Army Painter Speedpaints, which is weird because I loved the first set. So, you know, that's just my thoughts straight off. You don't have to watch to the end for that, but if you want to find out why, then let's get on with it. So first up, at first glance, this is a really good value set. Obviously, you get all the latest colors in here, which is fantastic. There's a really good range of them. They come in dropper bottles, which I really like. They've also got the ball in there, so that way when you shake them up, you can get them nice and mixed again, which is a really nice thing to have. And this time around, you also get metallics with this set, which at first got me really excited because I hate painting in metallics. So it was nice that they were included. So with a whole range of new colors and a new recipe as well that's meant to get around the whole issue of reactivation and some of the other complaints that were in the original Speedpaints, this kind of seems like a no-brainer kit. But it has some problems, but it also has some really fantastic things as well. So I'll do my best throughout this video to remain balanced with these. So let's kick it off with the good. And they work in a very similar way to the previous Speedpaints. So if you've used them in the past, basically they're a more thinned down paint that is meant to allow you to get down a really good base very quickly with very little effort. You get some highs in there, you get some mids in there, you get some lows as well, and you can kind of just slosh it on. In the past, I've used speed paints and contrast paints a whole lot, especially when it comes to batch painting or army painting or just getting videos out quickly to get my content done, and they are fantastic. And these are very similar to what we've seen in the past from Army Painter and their previous speed paint set. Playing around with some of the colours, it was nice to have a newer range because you were relatively limited with the previous set. There's some really nice, vibrant and bright colours with this set, and I had a lot of fun just playing around with them, seeing what looked good, seeing what didn't look quite as good. And how I did this is I basically printed off all of these Space Marine heads at 150% scale, primed them all white, and then sloshed on the paint. And this just makes it so much easier at first glance to see what's actually going to be in the bottle, because although they have that little triad symbol on the front, which is meant to show you what the colour looks like, it never really resembles the colour that's in the pot. The other thing is, the naming scheme is obnoxious. But I think this is just part and parcel of paints. I don't know why they always have to give them such stupid names. However, hats off to Army Painter. They have a little description in the bottom right, which basically tells you what you should expect from these paints. So at least that's then doesn't leave you guessing what on earth like nuclear sunset is going to look like. So once I've got all the little heads on there, and obviously we're not killing just normal Space Marines here, we're obviously killing word bearers, and especially Erebus. That's his head repeated 50 times on all those bottles. It was so much easier at this point for me to see what was in there. And like I said, there's some nice vibrant colors. There's a really nice extension to the range. So hats off to them there. You get a lot more to play with. I played around with a range of different base coats as well, just to see what looked best. And obviously, normally my go-to thing is doing a zenithal prime, which is where you go for a black prime and undercoat with a white from above. Now with this, you can get some really good results with contrast paints and also the previous speed paints as well. And the same can be replicated with the 2.0. They do get washed out in the darker areas and the more shadowy areas, but that's kind of what you'd be expecting from these. So if you're hoping to be able to go over those darker areas and just layer up, it's not really going to pay off. Now this is great for things like fantasy miniatures, stuff that's going to look a little bit dirty or grimy. It just allows you to play with it. And also as well, if you're going to go back in and highlight it anyway and build up on that base coat you're putting down, then honestly, I think a zenithal prime is just a great thing to go with. However, if what you're looking for is just a one coat and putting it on there, they can look a little bit faded. So it might be worthwhile going for something like a Wraithbone primer or just a pure white. On this miniature, for example, I had just used Wraithbone to undercoat it, and the great thing about this is it means that the colours pop a hell of a lot more, so things just look a lot more vibrant, you get a lot more out of the paints from these as well. But it does mean that you pretty much need to touch every single spot on this model with your brush. So again, pros and cons to each of those. I also did some pure white undercoats as well to see what that looked like, and again, things looked really good with this. It helped the colours to pop. It really brought out a lot more of that saturation, made it a lot more vibrant. It just gives much nicer results if that's what you're looking for. So ultimately, it really comes down to your painting style, what you want to get from it, and how quickly you want to get those models onto the board. Moving across onto the reactivation bit, and in my previous video, my first impressions, I did some playing around with this. First up, I basically painted one up. I then tried it with water on my brush and kept on jabbing it and dabbing it, and nothing reactivated, which, you know, 2 thumbs up there. I also used some speed paint medium on my brush and then started jabbing and attacking the model as well. no reactivation, so they seem to have fixed the reactivation when it comes to that sort of stuff. I also did some metallics over the top of these paints as well, because in previous speed paint, what I always found is if I use something like a silver over a brown, it would then start to mix in with the silver and it give me this like bronzy thing, and it would just ruin that above layer, which is really frustrating. Didn't happen this time around, and I tried it a couple of times on different minis, never had that reactivation issue, which again, 2 thumbs way up for that. Now, anyone who's watched the channel, I'm a really big fan of oil washes as well, so I tried some oil washes over these Cat Warriors. So this is a awesome little Kickstarter set by an incredible creator who does like 40K style stuff. It's called Katia Stands. Yeah, I think you know where he's going with that one. And they were just a lot of fun to paint up. So I sloshed this oil wash all over them. And in the end, I actually ended up doing 2 oil washes as well. So twice the chance for a reactivation. Happy to say I had no reactivations. Even when I went back in there with the little makeup sponges and started wiping all the stuff off, nothing came away from that layer beneath it. So it definitely seems as though they've fixed the reactivation. Another complaint from the previous set of speed paints was that they took a while to dry and they were quite wet and runny, and I definitely found this. Sometimes if you put too much of the speed paint on, they had a habit of then dripping over or running over into your other layers and then mixing together on the model, which could be a pain. They've definitely fixed that in this set. The problem is they've taken it too far, and this will lead me on to the bit where I don't recommend them, so we'll come on to that shortly, but they've definitely fixed it, but just in the very wrong way. So something else that I said I would try is I would try with the airbrush. So I grabbed my airbrush, and honestly, these paints work really, really nicely through them. You don't need to thin them down. You can just blast them onto the model, and again, if you go for like a zenithal underneath it, and then you go for your airbrush, you can get some really nice tones, and I did it on these 2 Marines by Gamuk, and things were looking good, but this is where you might be noticing some of the problems that we're going to come on to shortly. I also tried airbrushing with the metallics. And I've got to say, the metallics look gorgeous when you use them through an airbrush. You get some really nice, vibrant colors. The silver looks pretty flat, but that bronze color looks really, really nice. I've got to say, it's probably my favorite out of this set. Moving away from the airbrush though, when it comes to those metallics, they don't look anywhere near as good, at least in my opinion. They basically feel like someone's taken a metallic paint and put some speed paint medium in there, which is how I've painted metallics in the past. It's fast, it's efficient, and it's nice to have it bottled up and ready to go, but they don't feel like anything special. And I've got to say, when you put them onto the Mini for the first time, you're probably going to need a couple of coats. So the heads, for example, when I tried it on there, they do look pretty washed out. There's a lot of areas where that undercoat really shows through. So they're not the best, but they're nice to have. One thing that I was noticing as I use the speed paints is that they didn't seem as contrasty, and it feels as though they've taken a leaf out of Games Workshop book where they brought out their new range of contrast paints, and they felt more like just a single thin down layer. And they didn't have many like highs or mids or lows. A few of them were still like that traditional contrast paint or how speed paint work, but they were more like just one layer. It was quite a flat layer, a nice layer, but pretty flat. With Speedpaint 2.0, they certainly feel closer to that, but they don't feel as vibrant as the latest contrast paints, and they don't feel as contrasty as the previous speed paints. So I grabbed the old speed paints that I've got kicking around as well, because they're still some of my go-to paints, and I grabbed these 2 orcs. And for this one as well, it allows me just to test out how a grey undercoat works with a little bit of white from above, so that way everyone who's wondering how these work on grey can see that here. So I got the same set of colours and I did a comparison with them. And as I was using them, I just felt that the original set of contrast paints were nicer to use, and they added a fair bit more contrast, at least to my eye anyway. And things like the grey, for example, on the shield, you can really start to see the darker bits where it's sunken into all like the woodwork on the shield. But on the Speedpaint 2.0, although there is like a little bit of difference there, and you can see that contrast, it's not quite as noticeable as on the original speed paints. This definitely felt like it was the theme throughout the entire set as I was using them. They were nice enough to work with, but they didn't have quite as much contrast to them. And the other thing I noticed when I was doing them side by side is that the new contrast paints dry incredibly quickly. So they basically dried between me putting one layer down and moving on to the next. The previous layer was pretty much done. Whereas the contrast paint, by the time I'd done the whole model, everything was still wet on there. It was one of the complaints from the previous set. But that then brings me on to the issue with these paints and the reason why I don't recommend them. They crack. And I honestly think it's because of the drying time. So on this orc, it started to crack, like all the green started to crack and all the grey started to crack. On those Marines that I showed you where I airbrushed them, they cracked on the top as well. And a lot of the other ones, as I was painting them, started to crack. Now there's a consistent theme with this. When I airbrush, I use Army Painter Black Primer, and then I use Liquitex white ink from above. everything, or pretty much everything, that was primed with that Liquitex white ink started to crack. So obviously there's an issue then. That white ink is pretty glossy. It didn't matter how long I left it to set. Some of those models have been sat waiting to be painted for about 3-4 months now. So that prime has definitely had long enough to dry. It's nothing to do with that. I do honestly think it's because it's quite glossy, and because these dry quickly, it separates when it's on top of a more glossy surface. So you would most likely need to use some kind of matte varnish or more matte type primer. However, it didn't crack with just that. I also had some more matte primers that I'd used in the past as well. So on the Orc, for example, it was a grey primer and then a white primer from above, which was more matte, and that also cracked as well. So there were definitely issues there with the paint cracking, and it pretty much cracked the majority of the time I used it over my Liquitex prime and occasionally on other primes as well. When I used the Speedpaint 1.0, that never has happened before. I've never had that issue in the past, and I've always primed exactly the same way. And when I did the comparisons for this video as well, the Orc with 2.0 cracked, but the one with the original Speedpaints didn't. And to me, that's a massive issue and an absolute deal killer as well. Throw in the fact that some of the paints are just a bit weird, like Nuclear Sunrise, I tried to get it on a camera for you, has all these bits in it. And I don't know if that's meant to be part of the paint or if it's just poorly mixed. It's really weird. It's all these little dark bits of spottiness, and there's like no orange in the box either, which is really odd. So after that relatively long rambling rant about these, hopefully that's helped you to get an idea of how these new Speedpaint 2.0s do perform. In my honest opinion, I don't think they're worth it at the moment. Hopefully they get fixed, because Speedpaints are some of my favorite tools for pretty much any painter out there. They make the painting hobby just accessible and really easy, and at a pretty good price as well. You don't need to spend hundreds and hundreds of pounds or dollars or whatever to get your hand on some good paints. They're easy to pick up, they're easy to learn, and they're just great paints that give some great results. To average painters like myself, I can pull off some really good things with Speedpaints. So honestly, this paint set was a massive disappointment for me, because I was expecting some pretty big things. So obviously I have to, put that into perspective. I was expecting these to be as good as the first set. In my opinion, they just aren't. They fall miles short, and that's because they're just not, I don't know, they have their issues. They don't provide as much contrast with just one layer on there, which is a shame. But in return for that, you also get a much larger range of them. They dry faster and they don't reactivate. So it also has its pros as well. But obviously that deal killer is the fact that they're cracking. With the prime that I'm using at the moment, it just doesn't work. And with some of the others that I've used as well, which don't involve that Liquitex ink, they still crack, which is a massive issue. For a paint set that costs like £150, or I'm not too sure how much it costs in dollars, but for the amount it does cost, I expect much better from them, to do some more testing and everything else. But to have these cracking issues, honestly, it's a deal killer for me. However, if you're just using things like Core XY or Wraithbone primer, or just some other primer that pretty much works with this, they might be worthwhile going for. But I would recommend at least holding out, keeping your eye on different forums, keeping your eye on things like YouTube as well for some updated reviews in the future. And hopefully that issue with the cracking gets fixed, gets ironed out, because if they can fix that, then my opinion and my review will change dramatically, because then it becomes a lot more appealing in terms of, picking this up. So let me know if you've got any questions, throw them down in the comments below, and let me know your thoughts as well. Have you already picked up any of these? And if you have, are they cracking? Be really interested to know your experience and what other hobbyists are finding out there as well. But yeah, I hope that has helped you in your buying decision. And if things do change and I hear more about it, then I'll throw that down in the description below as well, to hopefully update you guys as well. So in the meantime, stay safe, like and subscribe, come along to my Discord channel where we chat all things hobby, painting, and all of that awesome stuff. And I'll see you soon. Bye.